So you want to own a cell tower. Buy the steel, rent out the space, watch the checks arrive. Simple. Here is the strange part. A cell tower is one of the only assets on Earth that becomes cheaper to run and more profitable at the same time, the more crowded it gets. Add a second tenant, and your costs barely move while your revenue jumps. Add a third, and almost every dollar of that new rent falls straight to the bottom line. In most businesses, more customers means more cost. Here, more customers on the same tower means something close to free money, and the tower owner spends his whole life trying to cram one more tenant onto steel he has already paid for. And here's the twist most people never suspect. A company that owns the tower is almost never the phone company whose name is on your bill. You drive past 100 of these things. You have never once wondered who owns them. An answer is a landlord, and one of the best landlords in the entire economy. By the end of this video, you will know exactly why a crowded tower prints money, what a patch of vertical steel actually costs to buy and build, who really pays the rent and who really collects it, and why the most valuable thing about a cell tower is not the tower at all. It is the lease underneath it. Let me open the ledger. The business that is not a phone business. Start with the single fact that reframes everything, because almost everyone gets it wrong. When you look at a cell tower, you assume it belongs to a wireless carrier, one of the big phone companies. For a long time, that was true. Carriers built their own towers, but over the past few decades, most of them figured out that owning thousands of tall steel structures was a distraction from their actual business, which is selling phone service. So they sold the towers off in enormous batches to specialized companies whose entire business is owning the steel and renting it back. So today, a huge share of the cell towers you see are owned not by phone companies, but by tower companies. And a tower company is not a telecommunications business at all. It is a real estate business, a landlord. It owns a structure and it rents out space on that structure to tenants, exactly like an office building owner rents out floors. Its tenants just happen to be wireless carriers, and the floors just happen to be mounting positions at different heights on a tower. Once you see it that way, the whole thing clicks into place. A cell tower is not a machine that does something. It is a piece of vertical real estate, and the business is leasing. Everything that makes it a good or a bad investment flows from that one fact. You are not in the phone business. You are in the landlord business. And your building happens to be made of lattice steel and happens to be very, very tall. And that reframing is worth holding on to because it tells you where to look. Nobody evaluates an apartment building by admiring the bricks. They ask who the tenants are, how long their leases run, and what the land is worth. A cell tower is the same. The steel is almost the least interesting thing about it. What matters is the rent roll, the contracts, and the dirt, exactly as it would be for any other land. The buy-in, so what does it actually cost to get into this, and how do towers change hands? There are two ways in. You can build a tower, or you can buy one that already exists, and they are very different games. Building is the hard road. First, you need the site, a patch of ground in a location where a carrier actually needs coverage, which is not just anywhere. Then you need the permits and the zoning, and towers are exactly the kind of tall, visible structure that neighbors and local authorities love to fight. So approval can take a long time and is never guaranteed. Then you build the thing, the foundation, the steel, the access, the power, the fencing. A single new tower can run into the low hundreds of thousands of dollars by the time it stands finished and ready for a tenant. And when it is done, you might have exactly 0 tenants and a very expensive piece of steel waiting for its first customer. Buying an existing tower is the easier but pricier road. A tower that is already standing, already permitted, and already has a paying tenant or two is a proven cash-producing asset, and it is priced accordingly. These change hands for large multiples of the annual rent they produce, because the buyer is not really buying steel, they are buying a stream of contracted, escalating rent with famously reliable tenants. The better the tenants and the more of them, the higher the price. And that points at the class gap in this bit. A bare tower with no tenants is speculation, an expensive bet that a carrier will someday need it. A tower with 3 solid tenants on long contracts is a bond, a near guaranteed income stream. Same steel, wildly different asset. And the entire art of the business is turning the first thing into the second. That is why 2 towers standing side by side, looking identical to anyone driving past, can be worth wildly different amounts. One might be a bare speculation with no income, worth barely more than its scrap value and its potential. The other might carry 3 long contracts with reliable tenants and rising rent, worth many times as much. From the road, they are twins. On paper, they are opposites, and the difference is entirely in the leases nobody can see. What you inherit. When you own a tower, what actually comes with it beyond the steel? First, and most importantly, you inherit the ground. Almost every tower sits on land, and often the tower owner does not own that land. They lease it from whoever does. A farmer, a landowner, a business. So underneath your rental income is a rental expense, the ground lease. And that lease is one of the most important numbers in the whole business. A cheap, long, secure ground lease is a treasure. An expensive or short one, with a landlord who can squeeze you at renewal, is a permanent vulnerability sitting underneath your asset. Second, you inherit the tenants and their contracts. These are long-term leases, often running many years with options to renew, and they typically contain the single most beautiful clause in the business, the escalate. That rent goes up by a fixed percentage every year, automatically, forever, whether or not anything changes. You will hear that number again later because it is the quiet engine of the whole thing. Third, you inherit the maintenance and the liabilities. A tower has to be kept standing, safe, lit, and compliant. It has to survive storms and ice, and a very tall steel structure carries real obligations: inspection, insurance, the responsibility for what happens on and around. None of this is enormous, but it is constant, and it is the cost side of the ledger. Fourth, you inherit the location, which is everything. A tower in the right place, where carriers need coverage and where zoning will never allow a competing tower nearby, is close to a local monopoly. A tower in the wrong place is a pile of steel nobody wants to. Concrete and antennas can be replicated. A location and the permission to be there often cannot. The revenue layers. Now the good part, where the money actually comes from and why this business is so beloved by the people who understand it. Revenue is rent paid by tenants, and it comes in layers. One per tenant stacked up the tower. So, the first tenant, your anchor. This is the carrier whose need justified the tower in the first place. Their rent is substantial, a meaningful monthly sum. But here is the thing. That first tenant's rent mostly just covers your costs. The ground lease underneath, the maintenance, the insurance, the overhead. An anchor tenant pays the bills and gets you to roughly break even. On one tenant alone, a tower is a modest, unexciting business. Some owners never get past this stage, and for them, a tower is a disappointment. A lot of steel and paperwork for a thin return that barely beats the trouble. They own a tower and wonder why everyone calls this such a wonderful business. The answer is that they are only seeing the first layer, and the first layer was never where the money was. Now the second tenant. This is where it transforms. A second carrier comes along, needing coverage in the same area, and rather than build their own tower next door, which is expensive and may not even be allowed, they rent space on yours. They mount their antennas at a different height on the same steel. Here is the magic. Adding them cost you almost nothing. No new land, no new foundation, no new access road, no new fence. Everything the second tenant needs already exists, built and paid for by you for the first tenant. All you do is let them bolt their equipment onto steel that is already standing and already earning. A tower is already built. Its ground lease is already paid. An access road already exists. So the second tenant's rent, nearly all of it, is profit. Your revenue roughly doubles while your costs barely move. And then the third tenant. Same story, only better. The tower is standing, the site is running, everything is already paid for. That third tenant's rent is almost pure margin. By now, the tower that broke even on one tenant is a highly lucrative asset on three. And the difference between the two is not more steel or more work. It is more tenants sharing a fixed cost you already covered. This is the whole secret, stated clearly. Costs of a tower are largely fixed. They barely change whether one tenant hangs off it or three. But each new tenant pays nearly a full rent. So profit does not rise gently as you add tenants. It explodes. Listen to that again. On a typical tower, the first tenant covers the costs, and the second and third tenants are almost pure profit. Say that again. Whoever owns a tower with 3 tenants is not making 3 times what a 1-tenant tower makes. They can be making many times more because the first tenant paid for everything, and the 2 after that arrived almost free. Steel did not change. Ground did not change. Work did not change. 2 more names on 2 more leases changed everything. That is why the entire game of owning towers comes down to one obsession: co-location. Getting more tenants onto towers you already own. Every tower company on Earth spends its days trying to add that second, third, fourth tenant to existing steel, because that is where the profit is not earned so much as discovered, sitting there, waiting on a tower that was already paid for. The ledger. So where does the money go? The cost side is short, which is exactly why this business is so good, but it is not zero. A biggest single cost is usually the ground lease. If you do not own the land, you pay rent on it, and over decades that adds up to real money. Smart tower owners eventually try to buy the land under their towers or lock in very long leases, precisely to kill this cost and control their own destiny. Then there is maintenance and inspection, keeping the structure sound, safe, and lit, repairing storm damage, meeting the rules that govern tall structures. Steady, predictable, not huge. Then insurance on a tall structure with expensive equipment and real liability. Then property taxes, depending on where it sits. Then the overhead of managing the leases, the tenants, the compliance, which for a single tower is small, but for a company owning tens of thousands of them becomes an organization. And that is close to the whole list. Notice what is missing. There is no expensive raw material being consumed. There is no product being manufactured and sold. There is no no inventory. A tower does not burn fuel to make its money. It only stands there, holding tenants, collecting rent that rises every year against a cost base that barely moves. It is one of the closest things in the physical economy to a money machine, which is exactly why the companies that own these at scale are some of the most valuable infrastructure businesses in the world. Consider what that scale looks like. A single tower is a nice little income stream, but a company that owns tens of thousands of towers, each with multiple tenants, each rent escalating automatically every year, is sitting on a vast, slowly rising river of contracted cash, backed by tenants who effectively cannot leave because their networks are physically bolted to the steel. That combination, huge scale, fixed costs, rising rent, and captive tenants, is why these companies trade at valuations that would make most industrial businesses weep. They are landlords with the best tenants in the world, in locations nobody else is allowed to build. The trap. But there is a trap, and it is the mirror image of everything that makes towers wonderful. Your whole business can be sitting on land you do not own. Here is how it catches people. You buy or build a tower. You fill it with tenants. Rent rolls in. It escalates every year. Life is good. But underneath your beautiful cash-producing asset is a ground lease. And one day that lease comes up for renewal. And the landowner, who has watched you collect rising rent for years off a tower on his dirt, knows exactly how much your tower is worth and exactly how impossible it would be for you to move it. Antennas, tenants, the whole business are physically bolted to his ground. You cannot pick the tower up and move it somewhere cheaper without destroying the very thing that makes it valuable, the location the carriers need. So at renewal, he has you. Everything you built sits on his ground, and both of you know it. Your leverage is zero, because the one thing you cannot do is walk away. The entire value of the tower is that it stands exactly there. He can raise the ground rent enormously, and you will pay, because the alternative is losing everything. A tenant who thought he was the landlord discovers that he was a tenant all along, and his own landlord holds the real power. This is the single most dangerous dynamic in the tower business, and it is why the smart operators are quietly obsessed with the dirt, not the steel. Steel is easy. Steel is safe. Ground underneath is where fortunes are quietly bled away. A second trap is the tenant concentration risk. If your carriers merge and 2 of your 3 tenants become one company, that company suddenly has 2 sets of equipment on your tower doing the job of one. And at the next renewal, they will consolidate, and one of your golden, almost pure profit tenants vanishes. In a business where the second and third tenants are the entire profit, losing one is not a small hit. It is a collapse of the margin on a tower whose costs do not fall to match. The history digression. It is worth understanding how this whole business came to exist because it was not obvious. For years, the wireless carriers built and owned their own towers, treating them as necessary infrastructure, a cost of doing business. Then a realization spread through the industry. Owning towers tied up enormous amounts of capital in steel and dirt. Capital the carriers desperately needed for the actual expensive rate, buying spectrum and upgrading their network. Those towers were just sitting there, a huge frozen asset, earning nothing extra. So the carriers made a trade that reshaped an industry. They sold their towers or leased them long-term to independent tower companies and then rented back the space they needed. It freed up mountains of cash for the carriers. It handed the tower companies something extraordinary. Thousands of existing towers, each with at least one guaranteed anchor tenant already on it, and enormous room to add more. Tower companies took assets the carriers saw as dead weight, turned them into one of the great cash flow businesses of the modern economy, purely by recognizing a truth the carriers had missed. Picture the deal from the tower company's side. On day one, they owned a fleet of towers already filled to a third or a half of their capacity, each with a blue chip anchor tenant locked into a long lease. Every empty mounting position above that anchor was a future near pure profit tenant waiting to be added, at almost no extra cost. They had bought, in effect, a vast field of half-planted money trees, and all they had to do was fill the empty branches. A tower was not a cost, it was a landlord's dream, and its best tenants were sitting on it already. The verdict? So, could you actually make money owning a cell tower? Yes, and this is one of the standout small to large infrastructure businesses, which is exactly why giant companies were built on it. But it lives or dies on 2 things: tenants and the ground beneath. Here's the good year. You own a well-located tower with a secure, long, cheap ground lease underneath it, and 3 solid tenants bolted to the steel. A first covers your costs. Second and third pour almost pure profit into your account. Every single year, the escalator clause lifts all 3 rents a few percent automatically for doing nothing at all. Your costs barely move. Your tower sits in a spot where zoning will never permit a competitor. And every year, quietly, mechanically, the thing throws off more cash than the year before, on steel you long ago paid for. There is no marketing to do, no product to reinvent, No factory to retool. Tenants renew because moving would cost them a fortune and a coverage gap. Rent rises because the contract says so. Your job, year after year, is mostly to keep the tower standing and go looking for one more tenant to add to it. Few businesses in the world ask so little of their owner while paying so reliably. It is about as close to a bond that grows as the physical world offers. And here is the bad year. Your ground lease comes up for renewal, and the landowner, who holds all the cards, triples your rent and your fat margin thins overnight. Or two of your three carriers merge, consolidate their equipment, and one of your pure profit tenants disappears, taking most of your upside with it. Or you built on speculation in the wrong spot, and the anchor tenant you were counting on never came, leaving you with an expensive steel monument to a coverage need that did not exist. In this business, the tower almost never fails. The lease underneath it and the tenants on top of it are where the danger lives. Same steel, standing in the same spot. What separates a fortune from a trap is who owns the dirt and how many names are on the leases. Thesis close. Look at a cell tower and you see a piece of telecommunications equipment. Something technical, something that belongs to the phone company. That is the illusion. What you are really looking at is a landlord. A patch of vertical real estate whose tenants pay rent that rises every year on a structure whose costs were paid long ago in a location the law will not let anyone else copy. A genius of it is that the more tenants you stack on the same steel, the more the fixed cost dissolves into pure profit. So that a crowded tower is not just better than an empty one, it is exponentially better. And the whole business is the patient art of adding one more name to the same steel. You are not buying a tower. You are buying a piece of the sky that people will pay you rent to touch. And the only two questions that matter are how many of them are paying and whether you or someone else owns the ground it all stands on.